Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta, and thank you for joining me on Consistent Preterism. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Millennium, but before I do that, I wanted to go over the daily announcements. I am still at the Mohegan Sun Resort in Connecticut, and just got back to my room for the evening. Lost a little bit more than I would have liked to tonight on roulette. We'll say that and leave it there, but it was a good time. I played for a long time, and a lot of times in gambling, you play for a while and you sort of view it as a win, all right? You might lose a little bit of money, but if you played for 3 or 4 hours like I did tonight and you only come away losing that much, I look at it as entertainment. It's an activity. It's excitement. And is that like me justifying my gambling? I don't know. But so it wasn't the greatest night. But looking around at some of the characters that were around me at the tables, throwing down crisp $100 like it was nothing, I walked out of there feeling pretty good. Let's see. We do have some announcements. Let's see. The first announcement is that I heard through the grapevine that Michael Miano is going to be debating Dr. Michael Brown. Okay, now I don't know how true it is, but that seems to be a rumor that is going around a little bit. And I don't know what the topic is going to be, and I'm quite frankly shocked that Dr. Michael Brown would take such a debate with Michael Miano. But obviously Michael Miano is probably excited for the opportunity to get a big audience and to explain some of the truths of the time statements and full preterism and all that. But Dr. Michael Brown is a master of maneuvering and a wiggler, and he can kick up enough dust and muddy the waters enough to make it seem like he's arguing, and most likely Miano will lose that debate on that basis alone. Never mind the fact that he's just not really a good debater. If you've watched him debate Sam Frost and others, it's just not that good. So that should be interesting. But yeah, so keep an eye out for that. That should be kind of comical. Excuse me. But the truth of the matter is they're both wrong. One of them thinks he's a Jew and God's chosen people. The other one thinks he's in a spiritual imaginary kingdom cult up in the sky in a new covenant. And they're both just completely wrong because none of the Bible had anything to do with them in the first place. So that should be interesting. The other news I wanted to go over is a guy named Jerry Superpowers Bowers. You may know him on Facebook. He's got a mouth that's dirtier than a truck driver. This guy drops more F-bombs than an NFL football team. And he's got longer, greasier hair than Joe Dirt after he ran through a mud bath. Jerry Bowers is he's pretty much like Joe Dirt mixed with Larry the Cable Guy. On crack is what I would describe him as. And he is a total wannabe. He believes and claims that he has powers of the Holy Spirit. In fact, in my old dealings with him on Facebook, he had told me that he actually has, healed people or has witnessed one of the two. I don't remember. I was laughing so hard at the time I couldn't really, remember or let what he said actually sink in. But according to Jerry Bowers, he has powers, so that's why I call him Superpowers Bowers. But yeah, this guy actually left full preterism, folks. He put out a post saying that he is no longer a full preterist, and I heard that, and someone sent me a snapshot of it. I didn't really get too much information as to what his reasoning was and as to why he left full preterism, but I know for a fact that over the last week or two he's been losing his shit over IO, and he's been trolling every post and basically having a Joe Simpson meltdown. And so the latest and greatest news is that he is now no longer a full preterist. You see what IO does? The truth of IO gets people so crazy that they actually go back to futurism. I mean, what a terrible, terrible place to be, where you can't even admit the truth. You have to go back to the most disgraceful time statement, audience relevance rejecting view that is futurism. And you have to do things with all these texts that fit so perfectly at the coming of the Lord in that generation and before some standing there died. And you have to do something with them. You have to figure out a way to twist, to dance, to muddy the waters, to come up with stupid, baseless, just illogical concepts and theories and all sorts of nonsense in order to justify your way back into the Bible. I mean, that's got to be a real bummer, right? Internally, they have to really feel that, like a swift kick to the you-know-what. But hey, you know what? All the best to him. I hope he, perseveres until the coming of the Lord. That happened 2,000 years ago. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So Jerry Bowers is now a futurist. Let's see what else I could say. What else can I talk about here? I had some other news, but of course I've had a couple of beers. I just ate a Ben & Jerry's ice cream cone as I sulked over my loss on the roulette table. So we're just going to get right into it, okay? The reason why I'm talking about the millennium, and I'm not here to define when the millennium exactly took place, because I feel like that has a lot of work that needs to be done on it, okay? And I'm not one to say one way or the other when exactly it began, okay? But what I can say is that I'm 99% certain as to when it ended, okay? And throughout my years of full preterism into my couple years now of Israel only, I've come up against arguments from the likes of Stephen Hakalugidale, Adam Marshalak, and others, and they seem to want to place the 1,000 years outside of AD 70. Okay, so when Jesus said that, these be the days of vengeance, speaking of when the army surrounded Jerusalem in Luke 21:20, I believe it is, these be the days of vengeance when all things written would be fulfilled. Basically what Jesus is saying there in a nutshell is that these are the days when all prophetic utterance would be wrapped up and totally fulfilled, all right? And people try to, get around that, but it's very clear, okay? Because the story was ending, because the Savior was coming for his saints. He would usher them into a new age. Their dead would be raised, which is the resurrection that they were looking forward to, that the 12 tribes served God earnestly day and night, hoping to attain, that being the age to come. It was all right there at the door, at the cusp of happening, and they were in the last days, not us. So it just makes perfect sense, that this was all kind of coming to its head, and the story would end here. But the millennium has kicked up a lot of confusion with people, and it's a place that many go to try to get around the obvious problems with full preterism. So full preterism says it all ended in AD 70. The millennium and everything ended in AD 70 at the coming of the Lord. And, and then these people come up and object that, even full preterists actually, and they say, no, it's impossible. The 1,000-year reign has to take place after AD 70. So essentially what you got is you got a complete halt of all prophetic and all revelation and all utterance from the God of Israel, Yahweh, around AD 70, right? After the prophets and everything was done, right? Completely silent from that point forward. Yet, we're supposed to believe that we're in the millennial reign of Christ, right? Where all these things are supposedly taking place as we lead up to the end and some final grand event. Well, don't you think that if that were the case, that there would be some form of communication going on? If there was still things left to take place in the storyline, don't you think that the God of Israel would be a little bit more available and a little bit more involved than he is right now? I mean, you have nothing, okay? There's nothing. Everybody's fighting over old, dusty, antiquated letters written to dead people, okay? So a lot of, stupid arguments come up from people who oppose Israel only when it comes to the millennium. Excuse me. And obviously, if you've listened to me for a while, you know some of my engagements with some of the wannabe clowns. Most recently, Joe Desperado argued that the millennium began in AD 70 and that we're still in it now, although he would argue that we're in it because he thinks, there's a new Jerusalem up in the heavens and down here is the earth, and he's all over the place, that guy. But he's another one who went to this millennium beginning in AD 70 argument. And many of them do, right? They look at Revelation 20 as if it's their way in. It's their loophole, right? The most confusing, symbolic, wackadoodle chapter in the entire Bible, probably. Full of symbols, full of wacky things going on, time jumping all over place, John looking back, looking in the present, looking a little bit in the future, then looking back again, then looking in the future, then looking back. I mean, it's all over the place, right? So they take this chapter and they hang all their caps on it. Every one of them. They get in a line, they all walk up, they hang their entire cap on it, okay? But it's just not working, right? Because when you really simplify the millennium, you can at least see when it ended, all right? And I'm going to attempt to do that for you very quickly today so that you can all use this when anyone argues against you and says that the millennium actually began in AD70 and still goes on. Now, that is the argument for many. They say that the millennium began in AD70. Now, some people say that it ended in AD132, which was that... the second tribulation period, I guess, on Jerusalem there. Some people say that it continues on today, so it began in AD70 and it's still onward and going today, so it would really be like, 1930 year reign so far. And some people say it was a literal 1,000 years. I've heard people say that it began in AD70 and ended in AD1070, right? I mean, there's all sorts of arguments and different theories and whatnot, but the real truth, I believe, is that the millennium ended at the coming when Christ came for his saints and delivered the kingdom back to God, and everything was put into subjection under him, right? Because Christ was ruling and reigning until he put all things under his feet, the last enemy being death. So let's go to Revelation 20 and see if we can do this quickly and easily and clearly, because that's the whole point of this, right? Because when you IOers, you truth seekers out there, you honest ones, when you guys go out into the battlefield, okay, and no, we're not waging against the principalities and powers of the air, okay, we're waging against wannabes and delusional dingbats of Facebook, all right? So when you guys are out there waging war against the likes of Jerry Superpowers Bowers or Robert Booze Guzzling Statzer after he wakes up from a 3-day bender and rolls out of his puddle of his own puke. When you guys are battling and engaging these guys and they're saying, well, the millennium began in AD 70, so how about that? Well, there's a way to really quickly dismiss that, to shut them all up and seal their lips. All right. Take them to Revelation 20 really quickly, okay? And all you have to do is show them Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 forward, okay? So in verse 7, we see that the 1,000 years has expired. Satan's released from his prison to go out and deceive the nations from the four winds of the earth. Now, obviously, the nations is ethnos there, which is also better translated as nation or people. So could it be that he was going out to deceive the people which were in the four corners of the earth? Who knows, right? But then there's this symbolism and all this wacky stuff going on, and they went up upon the breadth of the land and surrounded the camp of the saints, the beloved city, and fire came down out of God and out of heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was cast in the lake of fire and brimstone where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it. Okay, so notice John's transition. Now, I'll admit that not everything in Revelation is consecutive or in order, or chronological, I should say. John jumps around a lot. But in this portion in Revelation 20, we can clearly see that John has an order of events, okay? And that order of events takes place, and you can see it. You can see the first resurrection of the martyrs, okay? They're ruling and reigning with Christ for 1,000 years. Then we see at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan's released. There's a big war. And then all of a sudden, we see the great white throne judgment where everyone's raised and they stand before the throne and they're judged according to works. All right, so that obviously is the final scene, right? It doesn't make sense for the great white throne judgment to take place before the war, right? Because, that the war kind of fits into that, right? There's just judgment. There's judgment on Jerusalem, right? And they were judged according to works, okay? Now, look at verse 11 of Revelation 20, and this is where you can really destroy the millennium beginning in AD 70 argument. Okay, verse 11 says, Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was no place for them. And I saw dead, small and great, standing before God, and the books were opened. All right, now that's obviously the resurrection, right? Okay, who's going to deny that? Dead ones, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, and anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. All right, so there's a lot there, obviously, but what are we trying to get notice of here? What do I want you guys to take notice of? Well, I want you to take notice of that at this great white throne judgment, this final judgment, okay, when all the dead are raised, okay, clearly, because this is the last scene in the entire Bible. This is the last scene that catapults them into the New Jerusalem in the age to come. This is the final judgment, okay? And here they are, they're standing before God, and the books are open, and they're judged according to their works. All right, now, if we go back to Matthew chapter 16, verses 27 and 28, Jesus says to his contemporary audience, okay, he said, well, wait, yeah, let's start here. In this portion, Matthew 16, 27 to 28, he says, I will come, with my angels, and I will judge each one according to their works. Okay, same exact language that Revelation 20 uses here at the great white throne judgment. All right, Jesus says, I will judge each one according to their works. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here today as I speak that will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. All right, now, so basically what he's saying is that before some standing here die, he would return and judge them according to their works. So if we go over to Revelation 20 and we look at the great white throne judgment, what's taking place there? They're being judged according to their works. So that right there ties it together very, very nicely. Okay, we can understand now that the great white throne judgment, the final judgment, had to take place at least within the lifetime of the contemporaries of Christ when he said that in Matthew 16. Okay, now most people believe that would have been AD 30 to AD 33. So realistically, if he's speaking to adults, right, not children in that discourse there, then, maybe another 40 years to live would be about right. And so surely this makes pretty good sense, right? If the destruction of the temple would lead to the resurrection and the judgment, that all kind of ties in nicely at AD 70, right? Also, later on in Matthew 24, he said that this generation will not pass until all these things take place. And what were all those things? Well, one of them included the coming of the Son of Man for his saints, for his elect. They would go out, they would seek the elect from the four winds of the earth. The gospel would be preached to all nations, and then the end would come. He would come for his saints, okay? And that was said to be happening in that generation, said Jesus. So he backs it up again. Then if we look back in Matthew 10, we can also see Jesus say that you will not finish preaching through the towns of Israel before I come. So everything is linked to that generation. They were in the last days, folks, not us. All right, so when we go back to Revelation 20, we have to let the judgment according to works line up with what Jesus said about the judgment according to works, and that being it would happen in that generation and before some standing there died. Now, if the millennium begins in AD 70, then that's a problem. Because at the very least, if you take the idea that the second tribulation upon Jerusalem around 132 AD was the end of the millennium, then that puts about 100-year span between when Jesus said, some of you standing here will not die before this happens, and that period, which makes it really difficult to believe, right? Because if these people were, say they were even 30 years old, put another 100 years on top of that, that would have meant that these people would have had to live to be 130, which obviously we know is a bit of a stretch. Now let's take it even further and say those who say it was a literal 1,000 years that began in AD 70. Well, the year would be 1070 AD, and obviously Jesus told those that they would be alive when he came, some standing there. So unless these people were, a cool 1,050 years old, well, that won't work either. And then the more laughable position is that this 1,000-year reign still goes on today, and it began in AD 70, which would mean that it's over 1,900 years in running. So Jesus' words of this judgment according to works, some standing here will not die, would mean that those people who he said that to would be roughly 2,000 years old today if the Lord returned. They would have to be, right? Because he promised that some standing there would not die before his coming. So what's the point? Well, the point is that the judgment according to works absolutely demands that the great white throne judgment took place before some standing there died when Jesus said that. Then if we go a little bit further into this great white throne passage, we see what happens at the end, right? We see the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire and destroyed, is what that's saying. death and Hades are cast into the lake of fire. Now, obviously, death can't be cast into a fire. Hades can't be cast into a fire. So we know there's a lot of symbolism going on here. But the point that I'm trying to get you to realize is that this is when death is defeated. This is when Hades loses its sting. Okay, now does anybody remember 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul is talking about the final victory? You don't? Okay, well, let me read it to you. All right, now remember, John says that at the great white throne judgment, death would be defeated and Hades would lose its sting, or Hades would also be defeated, okay? Well, let's take a look here. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50. He says, "Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood, those bodies that you have that are made up of blood and guts, they cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does corruption inherit incorruption. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all die, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory?" Okay, so what do we have here, folks? Well, we have the coming of the Lord, okay? We have Paul telling them that we shall not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment at the last trump. That trumpet would sound, the dead would be raised, and the living changed. Both parties, dead and living, changed to immortal, caught up into the air in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, which was the coming of the Lord, according to what Paul said elsewhere as well. So the Lord was going to descend from heaven with the voice of an archangel, with the trumpet call, okay, like he said, and they would be changed, caught up into the clouds, where they would forever be with him. But take note of what happens at the coming. Look what Paul says. He says, "So when this corruptible, this flesh and blood body, has put on that immortal body, then shall be brought to pass the saying." In other words, then shall be fulfilled the saying, "Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory?" So what is that proving, folks? Well, again, Paul is corroborating that the death being defeated and Hades being defeated had to take place before some standing there died, because he said, "We shall not all die, but we will be changed at his coming at the last trump to immortal." Changing them to immortal was death being defeated, folks. That's the whole point. And so Paul puts that within the lifetime of the people to whom he was writing to. Some would still be alive, matching what Jesus said when he said, "Some of you standing here will not die before this occurs." So we have the judgment according to works, and we have death and Hades being defeated, both portrayed as being taking place in that generation and before some of them first century saints died. Then we have the great white throne judgment of Revelation chapter 20, saying that at that great white throne judgment, they would be judged according to their works, and death and Hades would be defeated. Now, the key that ties this all together here, folks, is when does the great white throne judgment occur? Any guesses? Well, it occurs after the millennium. The millennium's over, folks. Just look back a few verses. Now, when the 1,000 years has expired, Satan will be released. You have the battle, and then immediately you have the great white throne judgment, where the dead are judged according to works. Death and Hades is cast into the lake of fire, and boom, there they are in the new heavens, new earth, new Jerusalem, celebrating, singing, rejoicing. Okay, so the great white throne judgment links this all together and shows that the millennium was over by the time of the coming. Okay, it had to be. There's no other way around that. Everything was going to take place before some standing there died. The judgment according to works, death being defeated, Hades being defeated. And all those things took place at the great white throne judgment. So the next time somebody tells you, "Oh, the 1,000 years began in AD 70, say, "No, that doesn't work." Because Revelation 20 shows that the great white throne judgment comes after the 1,000 years ends. And that is the point when death and Hades are defeated, and they are judged according to works, which according to Jesus and Paul would take place before some standing there died. So you must honor the time statements. If you don't honor the time statements, then everything gets out of line. Okay? And like I put it to a good friend on YouTube, I would rather take the 100+ time statements that are clear, that are not found in symbolic, ultra symbolic books like Revelation chapter 20, all the statements in the Gospels, the epistles, the letters. I would take all those statements any day of the week, clear, undeniable time statements, like some standing here will not die before I come to judge you according to your works. I'll take that any day of the week, folks, over a tricky, confusing, ultra-symbolic portion such as Revelation 20. Okay? But when you look at Revelation 20, it actually does match what Jesus and Paul and everybody said when you understand it that way. So, for a moment there, it's like, is the Bible inconsistent? Is this contradiction? Well, not really. I mean, if you look at it that way, it makes perfect sense. Because the coming was the final event that would, wrap everything up. It would be at that time when death and Hades would be defeated. And that all happened after the millennial reign. So you could spin it back on the wannabe and say, well, if the millennium isn't over yet, then death and Hades aren't defeated. Right? Then nobody has eternal life. Nobody goes to heaven. Because nobody inherits the New Jerusalem until the millennium is over. That's the final thing in the entire story. The New Jerusalem, that, by the way, only had the 12 tribes' names on it, is inherited after the millennium ends. Millennium ends, great white throne judgment, judged according to works, death and Hades defeated, entrance into the New Jerusalem, celebrating with their Lamb and their Savior forever. No more pain, no more tears, no more death. The end. That's the story, folks. So slap that AD70 beginning millennium idea to the wall. I was sent a link to a video that I have to watch. Somebody has an idea that the millennium actually began in 66, or at least the martyrs began reigning in 66 and it ended in 70. I don't know how I feel about that, but I'm going to give that link a listen when I have some time and see if there's anything good in it. But yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly positive when the millennium began. I have a few different ideas and some passages in the Old Testament that lead me to believe that it's possible that it began back then, because we see Christ, the archangel, always, ruling and watching over the sons of Israel. Look at Daniel 12, for instance. The prince, which makes sense because his father was the king, was watching over the sons of Daniel's people. I mean, I don't know if that's ruling and reigning, but it's watching. And we see different other things in the Old Testament that could back that up as well. But who knows? I mean, it could be that he literally began his millennial reign when he ascended to heaven and took his seat at the right hand of God. But we know that when he returned, he would come for his saints, like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15. All those who are Christ would be raised at his coming, and then comes the end when he delivers the kingdom back to God and he hands over the kingdom to God. In other words, he hands everything over to God. Look, it says here, then comes the end when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, and he puts an end to all rule and authority and power, for he must reign till he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death, for he has put all things under his feet. But when he says all things are put under him, it is evident that he who put all things under him is accepted. Now when all things are made subject to him, that's God, then the Son himself will also be made subject to him who put all things under him, that God may be all in all. Now, I believe the all in all in that context still refers to all the elect, the chosen ones. The angels, they would change to angels basically. But, it's pretty clear to see that at his coming, he raises them all. The kingdom, which is Jacob, is delivered to God as his inheritance. And then God delivers the kingdom back to him, and all things are put under him now. Which would seem to imply that his rule and his reign, Christ that is, would be over at that point, because you can't hand the kingdom over to God and now be subject to God if you're still ruling and reigning. So it seems to be that at his coming, when he raised the dead and changed the living and delivered the kingdom to God, that seems to be when his reign ended. And of course that would correlate with what I just showed you in Revelation 20, along with all the time statements as well. So folks, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it made sense. If you did, please give it a like, give it a little thumbs up, and we'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.